of Policy Cures Research's latest report on the state of investment in sexual and reproductive health research and development. I'm pleased to be with you all. My name is Andrew Tuttle. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Policy Cures Research, and I'm with my colleague today, Maya Goldstein, who is PCR's Director of Research and Gender Lead. We're both actually in Dakar this week at the Grand Challenges annual meeting. So we know we're competing with some really exciting in-person sessions on the product innovation and policy landscape. Thanks for those that are making the time to be with us today. For any of you that are here in Dakar with us, we look forward to continuing to engage with you throughout the week. And a little plug, if you want a hard copy, we've got a few with us. So we'll be happy to offload those before we get on a plane later this week. The G-FINDER project, as a quick recap for those in the room today, and especially for those who might be new to this report and to the work of Policy Cures Research, we collect data on and analyze the investment landscape for product-related R&D in particular, and we do that across 3 different global health thematic areas. That includes poverty-related neglected diseases, emerging infectious diseases, and of course, sexual and reproductive health. We've been collecting investment data in the poverty-related neglected disease space for quite some time, since 2008. The emerging infectious disease scope we've covered since 2014. And the sexual and reproductive health scope is the youngest in our thematic areas. We've been collecting data in that space since 2018. This is the 3rd iteration of the G-FINDER SRH report. Its title is Beyond Spillovers, and it's examining 4 years of investment data. So that's fiscal years 2018 through 2021. It includes an analysis of product-related R&D funding, as I mentioned, for sexually transmitted infections, HPV and HPV-related cervical cancer, contraception, multipurpose prevention technologies, preeclampsia and eclampsia, postpartum hemorrhage, and what we refer to as crossover R&D or R&D for more than one of these health issues. Of note here, there are some critical SRH diseases and health issues such as HIV, hepatitis B. These are covered in our G-FINDER report on neglected diseases, so they're not included here as separate chapters in the report. But as with all of our G-FINDER data across all of our disease areas, this data is available in its most recent and updated formats on the G-FINDER data portal. I'm going to ask my colleague Emmanuelle, she's going to pop a link to the G-FINDER data portal in the chat for all of you, just as a quick reference. But all of this data is live, it's in the public domain, and it's available to you all to use and manipulate as you'd like. A couple of housekeeping things for our session today. We have an hour scheduled. Please keep yourselves on mute if you're not speaking, but do feel free to engage with us and with each other in the chat throughout. We're recording today's session for those of you that can't attend. There is live captioning available for anybody that needs it, and we'll endeavor to speak clearly and slowly. But please do let us know if we're not doing that very well. I will shortly hand over to Maya, who's going to walk us through the key findings of the report, and then we'll open things up for discussion and Q&A. And we'll close with a few exciting developments we're happy to share about the future of this report and some of the new directions we'll be taking it in. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Maya. She has been instrumental really in standing up the G-FINDER SRH project and making this report and our previous ones possible. As I mentioned, she's the Director of Research and Gender Lead at Policy Cures Research. She's been with the organization since 2018 and has a really impressive body of expertise in the SRH space. So we're lucky to have her and have her vision in designing and executing a growing portfolio of gender intentional research within the organization. So with that, Maya, I'll hand things over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. That was a really unexpected and lovely introduction. So thank you very much. I'm going to jump straight in because we have quite a lot of data and stories to get through. And I will really try to speak slowly. There is quite a lot to say. So if I'm rambling or I'm not making sense, please do let me know and I'll try and slow down. So next slide, Andrew. So at a very macro level, funding for SRH R&D has grown over the last 4 years, which is great. We're now at a total across those 4 years of $2.1 billion. That's a growth of nearly 200 million since 2018 and a rise of 50%. But this growth has not been distributed equally. So apart from a really large rise, which you can see there at the grey at the bottom in non-issue specific R&D, which Andrew mentioned, which is, most of that actual increase in issue-specific funding, which is the rest above, which is 121 million of the total 193 increase, was geared towards R&D for STIs or issues related to them. So that's HPV and HPV-related cervical cancer, for example, which rose 53 million across those years, as well as other major STIs, which rose by 68 million in total, and most of that via big boosts in funding for gonorrhea and genital herpes, or HSV2. Actually, HPV, gonorrhea, and HSV2 together accounted for 94% of the net growth in issue-specific SRH funding across those 4 years. So while overall funding for non-maternal SRH issues, so STIs, HPV, contraception, and multipurpose prevention technologies rose quite a bit, in stark contrast, funding for maternal health issues in the report, of which we have 2, postpartum haemorrhage and preeclampsia, actually fell. And together they received just 22 million in 2021, which is a drop of nearly 15% across those years and from budgets that are already really quite light. The next slide. So if we dive into the data for each of these areas a bit, we get a better sense of what's going on. So as mentioned, most of the growth in overall SRH R&D came from increased investments in major STIs covered in this report. So in fact, STI funding has nearly doubled since 2018, rising 86% and reaching 146 million in 2021. So most of this increase is due to ongoing funding from industry and the NIH. And in fact, the latter, the NIH, is the single largest funder of STI funding every year since we've collected data. As mentioned before, the major focus of this investment continues to be on gonorrhea. And this is largely from industry and NIH-led vaccine development. And you can see that on the graph with the blue line in the middle. This is part of a global focus on prevention, given the serious threat of AMR gonorrhea we're facing today. And this was also accompanied by some support for new drugs as well. The other major investment area is in herpes, or HSV2, which continues to dominate and be dominated by funding for biologics, and that's the dark green box, and largely for therapeutic vaccines. This has actually increased 80% since 2018 and represents 91% of all STI biologics funding. It's probably worth noting, though, that a lot of this funding overall remains at very early stage or has just entered clinical development. So we're still a little way off products advancing through the pipeline. You can probably see then from STIs that a lot of these funding trends are following pressing domestic or global health issues. Next slide. So HPV2 was also responsible for a major increase in overall SRH funding, and it's been rising steadily every year since we started collecting data. This funding is also dominated by vaccines, again, that blue column, which includes early stage industry funding and those from a range of other donors, including the NIH, German BMBF, and the Gates Foundation, towards both novel vaccines and improvements to existing ones. And the latter, in fact, includes a lot of dose reduction studies, which preceded and then fed into the recent 2022 announcements from WHO that a single dose regimen from HPV is just as efficacious as multiple. We also saw a rapid growth in device funding, and a lot of this came from Unitaid for handheld thermal ablation devices, and some of that funding from them also went towards diagnostics for novel AI-based tools. There's also actually an interesting sharp rise in biologics funding for HPV, and again, therapeutic vaccines mostly. And this was via a 70% increase from NIH and new funding streams from Gates and other small and medium enterprise industry funders. There's actually a big jump in clinical development funding for HPV too. And a lot of this is across product areas, but a lot in the biologic space, which is really interesting and quite promising to see what's going to come from that. So again, I guess with HPV, the funding trends are following global pressing issues and particularly calls to action and a global consensus around eliminating HPV as a public health issue, and particularly through prevention strategies such as vaccines. Next slide. So on the other hand, contraceptive R&D has largely stagnated and has started to fall a bit. And a lot of this fall is due to decreases in investment from industry, which actually fell 42% between 2020 and 2021. Most of the focus of contraceptive R&D is on long-acting and reversible methods and almost exclusively on devices and combinations. You can see in the bottom right that table on duration of action. And by LARCs, we mean things like IUDs and hormonal IUDs, as well as 1-year intravaginal rings. Although this did experience 3 years of consecutive decline, LARCs are still the major funding focus of contraceptive R&D. Apart from strong investment in contraception with multiple and unspecified durations, which really just means funding for multi-product and multi-year projects, such as Contraceptive Clinical Trial Network or funding to organisations like Pop Council. We then have the next level of interest areas in short-acting methods, and again, mostly on drugs. So we're talking here about monthly oral contraceptives rather than daily, newer and long-acting injectables, and things like the Nest gel for men. Although on-demand methods received only a small share, I think it's 3.8% in 2021, it's probably worth noting that if we include contraceptive components of MPTs, which we'll discuss later or next, many of which are on demand, it would add at least 32 million extra in on-demand contraceptive R&D. And so that's things like vaginal gels, films, and fast-dissolving inserts. Lastly, permanent contraception continues to receive the lowest amount. And for us, this is largely characterized by a grant from the Gates Foundation to Oregon Health and Sciences University for a novel sclerotizing polydocanol foam. So there are also some really interesting trends in contraceptive R&D investment towards more diverse products, but we're going to touch on this a bit later. Next slide. So meanwhile, funding for MPTs has fluctuated. It's dipped quite a bit and is now rebounded to nearly 50 million in 2021. These peaks and troughs have been driven largely by changes in industry investment and particularly fluctuations in funding for MPTs that provide dual protection against pregnancy and STIs, and as they've been moving through the pipeline. So these types of MPTs, which are indicated for pregnancies and STIs, receive well over half of the investment of MPTs. And you can see that again in the, it's quite small, but in the bottom right. The majority of this is coming from industry-led development of topical microbicides, and this also actually accounted for the sudden growth in microbicide funding in 2021, which is the kind of the palish green, which was driven by funding for pivotal late-stage trials testing STI elements of an on-demand contraceptive MPT. MPTs do continue to be focused and driven by user-centric design, though. So with 90% of products in the portfolio are user-controlled and 76% are non-hormonal, although currently all of them are focused on female end users. Again, I think we'll touch upon this later in the next section. Next slide. So there are some good news stories for much of the non-maternal SRH space, but what about maternal health issues? So unfortunately, as mentioned at the start, these seem to be lagging behind quite a bit. Next slide. Preeclampsia R&D has steadily fallen over the last few years. And while that initial jump in 2019 was due to was scope related, so we actually expanded our scope to include some different products and inclusion criteria, there's been a steady decline since then. A lot of these fluctuations were driven by reported biologics funding and a decline in both biologics and diagnostics. The biologics rise and fall was itself driven by some industry investment in the development of a polyclonal antibody for the treatment of preeclampsia, but unfortunately that was abandoned in 2020 for futility reasons and explains a lot of that drop-off. In fact, outside of that, the preeclampsia biologic R&D is pretty steady, actually. Reductions in diagnostics are then due to absence of investment from some major funders in the space. That includes the NIH, Grand Challenges Canada, and the European Commission, but this is following completion of projects. So it's unclear whether that's a complete abandonment or just the wrap up of specific projects. So for preeclampsia, trends are following some progression, although rather stagnation of the pipeline and some projects wrapping up. Next slide. And similarly, PPH funding has declined a lot over the years across the board and across product types. It's dropped to just under $1 million in 2021. So although no funding was reported for PPH devices in 2020 and 2021, it's worth noting that these figures don't include some funding reported from intermediaries, which we don't count so that we don't end up counting things twice across different years. This includes some funding from WHO HRP, which did fund some phase 3 trials in Vietnam, evaluating the effectiveness of 4 uterine balloon tamponades or UBTs. It also doesn't include PATH's Devices, Diagnostics and Drugs to Address Women's Health Needs program, or DAWN3, funded by FCDO, which funds a mix of different products for both preeclampsia and PPH, which is why it doesn't feature here. It features in the non-issue specific funding. But DAWN actually did receive $6.9 million over the last 4 years from FCDO to advance their portfolio of 4 products, 2 of which are for PPH. One, the Ilavi uterine balloon tamponade, and the other sublingual oxytocin. The latter, I should note, was actually abandoned from their portfolio after failing to meet thresholds for clinical relevance. So that's a bit of a shame. Excuse me. I guess meanwhile, the drops in drug funding are slightly different and largely follow heat-stable carbetocin's finalization of the clinical trials in 2018 and moved to its first approval in 2020 and being added to the WHO Essential Medicines list. So funding for PPH in some way follows the drops, rather follows progression through the pipeline, which is positive. But it also looks like there's a drop of interest in the area and it might be losing momentum. Next slide. So having said that, although trending downwards, our analysis of the preeclampsia PPH pipelines through a separate project with a number of partners shows there's actually quite a lot of activity in the pipeline and from organizations which are not reporting their funding to G-FINDER. So you can see here in this slide the overview of the maternal health pipeline for a few different maternal health areas, which follows drugs, biologics, dietary supplements, and devices. So, and although it looks healthy, so there's about 90 active candidates for preeclampsia and just over 30 for PPH. Much of this landscape does focus on testing repurposed products, or has a lot of candidates in preclinical stage, or at post-registration studies of existing drugs, such as with PPH. Meaning there's not a lot of truly new stuff coming through. So it does seem that the maternal health R&D landscape continues to be neglected on both the pipeline and funding side. Next slide. If we look past the numbers, we can probably get a better sense of some of these stories in context. Next slide. For example, why is maternal health so much more neglected than other SRH issues? There is probably, although definitely, a number of reasons for this. And one, as mentioned before, is probably because we underestimate the true level of funding. Although our G-FINDER survey is huge and broad, we know from our pipeline, as I just mentioned, that we're missing data and participation from some organisations. So that's just a limitation of the data we have. But another reason might be because of the types of data we collect. So we recognise that many SRH issues have a dual market. That is a need for new tools in both high-income countries and lower middle-income countries. So we purposefully include R&D that's applicable to LMICs, regardless of whether it's specifically intended for that market or not. While this means that we exclude HIC-only technologies, so really high-tech stuff, it does hide the motives for some of the funding. And so then, interestingly, when you look at the burden of disease or health issues versus investment, what we're seeing is, by and large, that an increasing share of burden in high-income countries is a reasonably accurate predictor of how much money was spent on it. For example, high-income countries experience more than 15% of the global burden of genital herpes, but less than 1% of the burden of maternal health issues. And so then when you look at the funding, HSV2 R&D received twice as much funding as maternal health, despite maternal health being responsible for more than 10 times the global burden, and especially, and almost exclusively rather, in LMICs. Similarly, funding for gonorrhea, which is another area of relatively substantial burden in high-income countries, particularly because of the current threat posed due to AMR, was even higher. So more than 2.5 times was spent, the total for maternal health, addressing an issue with less than 1/30th of maternal health's global burden. So while this funding is actually, I'll just go back 1 year, is actually for LMIC applicable products and will probably eventually spill over to LMICs, which is definitely a good thing. There's no guarantee these will reach them in a reasonable time frame, and it also doesn't account for adaptations and regulatory issues, which also take time. It also really distorts attention away from areas like maternal and pregnancy-related conditions, where the burden has significantly been reduced in most, but not all, high-income countries. And this is particularly an issue for maternal health areas like PPH, for example, which really do require LMIC-targeted interventions, low-tech devices or heat-stable formulations to replace current gold standard drugs like oxytocin, which, while are excellent, are not really appropriate for all low-resource settings. Next slide. In a similar sort of spillover train of thought, SRH has also benefited from COVID-driven increases in investments for platform technologies. And in fact, as mentioned at the very start, non-issue specific funding like this represented the single biggest area of growth in SRH R&D over those 4 years, and particularly for platform technologies. Platform technologies in this graph are all the bluish variations. So this is obviously also definitely a good thing, but it doesn't necessarily reflect a deliberate choice or commitment from funders to SRH. And broadly applicable platform technologies, while counting as SRH applicable R&D, are often not intended to address SRH issues. And this is true, actually, of many platform technologies anyway, that are ultimately used in ways that was not originally conceived by their inventors. I mean, so while this is still positive, I guess the point is that we should probably celebrate this growth area with some caution, knowing that the single biggest area of growth for SRH R&D was actually a global spike in funding for things and tools for a variety of non-SRH diseases. Next slide. So just warping back to the note I said about contraception, I guess a really positive note from the data, though, is that some SRH areas, particularly contraception, are showing investments in innovations that are meaningfully moving towards meeting the specific needs of end users, and particularly those in LMICs. So we know the unmet need for contraception is not just about access. We know a major driver is around discontinuation or complete non-use. due to real or perceived side effects of the currently available FP methods that we have. So there is definitely a demand and a need for diverse products such as user-controlled products that don't need to be administered by a healthcare professional, or for a wide range of options such as low or completely non-hormonal contraceptions, or those that cater to male users as well. There is some really encouraging signs of progress in this space. If you look at the middle graph here, you can see that there was a proportional fall of investment in hormonal methods for contraception. And on the far right, also a fall in non-user controlled methods over the last 4 years. Likewise, on the left, there's been a small drop in investment for contraceptive methods geared towards female-only users. And this reflects a more positive move towards more gender equitable healthcare, and acknowledges that a broader range of options are what's needed and what's being demanded. This landscape for contraceptive R&D kind of mirrors some of the gains already made for multi-purpose prevention technologies, where almost 2/3 of historical funding has gone to products which are both non-hormonal and user-controlled. So these are quite positive stories. Next slide. So at the same time, SRH funding has also become more diverse, which is also a good thing. The US NIH and industry have every year comprised over half the global share of R&D investment in SRH, and this is actually still true today. But the proportion has fallen, and this reflects growing interest and commitment in funding from other sources, such as the European Commission, UNITAID, the Gates Foundation, and the German BMBF, among many others. But I would say, and you can see that on the left, there's a sort of a slightly broader take on the top funding. But I would say that funding remains pretty concentrated, and the top 10 funders still account for more than 93% of the total as of 2021. So there's still definitely room for diversification and expansion here. Given the current global attention to women's health, including women's health R&D, we're pretty optimistic that this enthusiasm will translate into greater funding. And actually, given most SRH issues affect women and girls either exclusively, disproportionately, or differently, with a particular burden on LMICs, there is some hope that funding for LMIC applicable SRH R&D will also rise, and soon. Last slide. So, however, and overall, the problem is funding for SRH R&D still pales in comparison to other global health areas. So you can see from this graph, the $594 million in 2021 funding for all SRH R&D, and that's all the purple dots, remains just a small fraction of the amounts devoted to, for example, HIV at 1.5 billion, which is there on the right, or COVID-19 R&D at 5.6 billion in the same year. So if we're going to move things through the pipeline and really turn our attention to focusing on the burden of SRH issues, attention really needs to bring with it increased genuine commitments to funding. And to be successful in this space, this funding also needs to be coupled with a commitment to the specific and individual needs of people in LMICs. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone. That's the wrap up of the data.
Brilliant.
I'll hand
Thanks.
it to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Maya. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I want to open things up if people have questions. I have been following a few questions that have come through in the chat, and I want to just take a second while people are thinking of questions they might like to raise their hand and ask. We can address some of those. So yes, I think Emmanuel's already responded. We are recording the session. We'll be glad to share it. To Annie's question, yes, we will be happy to share the deck, but I would also encourage you to look at the report itself, where we do include quite a lot of detail. All of these graphs and figures and statistics are featured there in the narrative, and Emmanuel has provided a link just now to the report where you can find it on the website, as well as a shorter version of the executive summary. And Annie, to your second question about sharing the list of innovations. So what I might ask Emmanuel to do is also to include a link to our maternal health pipeline site. This is the project that Maya had mentioned. It's called the Accelerating Innovation for Mothers program. It's a separate project, but we have done a historical mapping of the maternal health pipeline, including an indication of which candidates are under active development, and there's quite a lot of detail about individual profiles, who the developers are, what the use cases are, what the clinical development cycle, life cycle of those particular candidates or products are. So would encourage you to look there, and I think it will provide a lot of the information that you're looking for. And finally, to Fiona's question on whether or not we have the R&D funding by countries, it is possible to filter the G-FINDER data on the portal by country, but just to note that that filters by funder country. We do have the ability, we are increasing the quality of our data with respect to what we call onward funding, which is a mapping of the geographic location of the recipients of this investment. There are notable gaps in that data, but we are working to fill those gaps. So yes, it is possible on the G-FINDER data portal to start interrogating the data a bit to see some of the geographic dimensions of it. Okay. While you're all thinking of other questions, and please feel free to raise your hands and turn your cameras on if you'd like to contribute. I'll keep following the chat and the Q&A function if folks feel more comfortable submitting their questions there. But maybe I'll direct a question to Maya just to get us kicked off. And one of the things that you mentioned, Maya, in your presentation was some optimism about the future of investment in women's health and sexual and reproductive health. And I'm wondering if you can just share maybe some of the initiatives that you're aware of that are leading you to have that optimism.
Sure. There are a lot, which I think is really, really super encouraging. I suppose some top of mind, given we're here in Dakar, is there's been a huge initiative from in collaboration with the US NIH and Gates Foundation, but also involving a lot of SRH actors in the space, I think over 200 across the world, in something called the Innovation Equity Forum. This was a year-long process to identify priorities and opportunities in women's health innovation specifically, and culminated in a consultation in July in the middle of the year. And from that was produced a roadmap called the Opportunity Map. That's actually just, and I say timely because of Dakar, because it's just been launched here at this Grand Challenges too, and is available, I'm fairly sure, on the NIH and Gates websites. It's a really exciting piece of work because it offers a consensus-driven set of priority areas for investment in women's health with high potential for impact and return on investment within a quite specific, limited 15-year timeframe. So it's quite action-orientated. And I feel that that's a really positive step towards bringing the sector together and galvanizing support in this space. We also had a whole day in Dakar dedicated to women's health and directed to funders, which I think is a first here at Grand Challenges, which is really positive. And I mean, numerous other things that you have domestic issue initiatives, such as driven by, for example, the Women's Health Access Matters initiative in the US. So while this is really working on US domestic policy, it's also working in a space which influences a critical source of funding for global health R&D in the US, and it's pulling political levers at pretty high levels. You've got national leadership in influential countries like the UK, which are using policy mechanisms to include women in clinical trials, such as through the Birmingham Health Partners. You have a number of countries with feminist foreign policies now, such as Canada and the Netherlands. And I think another one which would be good to look at is the maturation of Africa CDC. And I think one of the core strategies for them is readying the clinical trial ecosystem in Africa. So if clinical trial capacity is advanced here, I think we have a better foundation to conduct more innovative R&D on issues relevant to women, and particularly inclusion of women and pregnant people in clinical trials on the African continent. So there's loads, and tons of grassroots initiatives too, which are awesome, but too many to mention.
Brilliant. Thanks, Maya. No one's raising their hand, so I'm going to go back to questions in the chat and just use this as an opportunity to answer some of those questions. So, Maimuna, you had asked if COVID research has decreased from 2021 or has it remained stable. We are in the process now of wrapping up the last of our cross-checking and data cleaning for 2022 data, and that will be released very early next year. But I can maybe share a bit of a preview that maybe as expected, we have seen some declines in COVID R&D funding between 2021 and 2022. That's maybe not so surprising given just how much investment went in through mechanisms for vaccine development, which would have leveled off and slowed down certainly in 2022. Annie asked another question on whether or not the report can be shared with investors. Yes, please share the report as widely as you'd like. All of this data is in the public domain, and we really encourage as many folks as want to engage with it and query it and to bring questions our way as well. Sugarita asked a question on whether we have data on menopausal health. I will make, when we wrap up today, I've got a few announcements about some of our intentions for the scope of the SRH project within G-FINDER, and we are exploring the inclusion of other gynecological or life stage conditions or issues, including menopause. So at the moment, we don't have any data on menopause, but it could be that in the future that is an issue area covered by G-FINDER. Lisa, thank you for sharing a link to the Women's Health Opportunity Map. That's fantastic. Fiona, you asked a great question on tracking other funding costs besides R&D. And yes, this is something that we are also very interested in, but it does the kind of machinery, our machinery is geared towards looking at the product related R&D side of things. We do acknowledge that that is just a piece of the pie and a piece of the overall story when it comes to access and impact. So there are no immediate plans for us to collect this data. But there, I can give a plug for some great work that our colleagues at PATH are doing, thinking about other types of commitments that are being made in the R&D space that maybe look more holistically across the value chain, from political commitments, for manufacturing, for regulatory harmonization, for access issues. And I think things like that are very complementary for the type of data and figures that we're sharing here. There's a question from Grace on investments going to R&D specifically for contraceptives that are targeting men. And LMICs, there are literally not many options for men, and perhaps this is an area that needs attention. What are your thoughts on this? Maya, do you have any thoughts that you want to share on that front?
Completely agree. And I don't know whether any of our colleagues from the Male Contraceptive Initiative are on this call, but I did bump into them, a few of them here in Dakar. And they're working specifically on trying to boost investment and interest in this space as a totally neglected field in contraceptive R&D. But I think I alluded with those slides that at least there seems to be a trend towards expanding investment in male-focused contraceptive R&D, and our data shows that, which I think is really, promising. And actually, there's some really interesting clinical stage products in development and being tried in the US and in other places, which is great because that means we're already one step further to them getting into the hands of users. Although noting that with all of these things, and specifically with contraceptives, there's a pretty long lead time before they get to market.
Yeah, really good point. Okay, the chat is great. People are pretty shy today in asking questions. So while you're still thinking of that, I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead because a few questions have come through in the chat. that I think are hinting at some of the updates that I wanted to share about the future of the SRH report. So I'm going to go ahead and share those. And if that spurs some other questions, then we can use the time that we've got remaining to answer those. So bear with me for a second, and I'm going to reshare my presentation here. Okay, so as I mentioned, I want to shift our focus to the future for just a few minutes and share with you some exciting updates about the future of the SRH report. We've just been talking about the fact that there's growing momentum among advocates, among policymakers, product developers, researchers, funders that are working to continue breaking down the gender and sex-driven barriers that continue to plague the R&D landscape. We've ourselves been reflecting on the inclusiveness of the G-FINDER scope, and we're pleased to announce a new piece of work that's going to focus on a feminist women's health review and expansion of G-FINDER. So what does this mean? Well, one of the key motivators for considering this work is this question, which is, within a global health context, what is being spent on and done in biomedical innovation for women's health? And this is a question we're very interested in answering and collecting data for. When we use the term women's health, I think it's important that we acknowledge, though, that sex and gender are different things. They can often be conflated when we talk about women's health, but we just want to acknowledge that gender identity is complex. It's certainly not binary. And when we use the term women, our definition is this is a shorthand to refer to people with assigned female sex characteristics at birth, and that includes people that identify as female, but also those that don't, that identify as male or non-binary. So in order to answer that question that I put up on the slide just before, we need to take a careful look across global health areas. Some of those are already in our purview: neglected infectious diseases, emerging infectious diseases, and sexual and reproductive health. But we also need to look at chronic and non-communicable diseases and identify this key intersection from a disease and product perspective between global health and women's health. As Maya mentioned in her presentation, in a few different ways, I think women's health can often be thought of and defined as conditions that are exclusive to those with female sex characteristics. But the reality is that there are many health issues that impact women disproportionately or differently in terms of disability or comorbidities or other health outcomes. So in reality, our current view, our current insights into the R&D landscape, both from a funding and a pipeline perspective, they're quite limited when we contemplate the breadth of issues that are impacted by both sex or gender-driven market failures. So we're not promising to complete this circle and fill the entire knowledge gap, but we do anticipate expanding our scope to include a wider range of issues, particularly those that impact women exclusively and disproportionately. And as a result of that, we expect that a number of new conditions that intersect with the SRH global health area will likely be added to next year's G-FINDER survey. And we anticipate that including some additional gynecological, obstetric, and sexual health issues. So this we're calling this SRH Plus data would then be available and tracked routinely as part of the G-FINDER project in the years to come. So that's the exciting announcement I wanted to share about our upcoming work in reviewing the G-FINDER scope on women's health. I'll pause again to see if anyone has any other questions that they'd like to add. I'm going to take one last look at the chat as well.
There was a question in there on data on startups and acquisition, and I think this alludes to a point which we're very cognizant of, which is that our data is really specifically focused on grants level funding, which means we, I guess, actively would say don't include venture capital and other investment type data. We've done this is sort of a historical decision based on G-FINDER looking at LMIC specific funding over the life of the G-FINDER product, largely to neglected diseases and neglected disease space. But it's interesting because in SRH we know this dual market exists, and actually venture capital for contraceptives, for example, is quite a large part of the investment portfolio there, and we totally recognize we're missing that. So a few years ago, when I gave a similar presentation, I said something like, "We'll look into it," and I feel a bit bad that I'm saying the same thing, but genuinely, I think this type of conversation and this type of data is back on the table, because if we're expanding our scope as well and looking at this dual market across a broader range of women's health issues, we're going to have to look at potentially at a broader range of investment options too, and how we deal with that.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks, Maya. Okay. Well, look, if there are no questions, I think we'll probably move to close the session today. Before we do that, though, I just want to extend a really big thank you to the entire Policy Cures research team that made this report possible. We've got a really amazing group of very talented people, and they all have quite different backgrounds and expertise, but all of those are essential for collecting, deciphering, analyzing, and presenting this data. So it's a big team effort. Maya and I are the lucky ones that get to present it to you all, but a huge thanks is deserved by them. With that, I'd like to thank you once again for joining us today, for taking the time, especially those that are here scurrying between sessions at the Grand Challenges annual meeting. We look forward to our continued collaborations and partnership with you all, and thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.